Hello, I'm Jeff Penny, and welcome to the debut episode of My Favorite Sound From, a show where we speak to sound designers, technical sound designers, and other game audio professionals about some of the work that means the most to them, that they did that they're the most proud of and just want to share with the world. So, with me today, I have Ronny Mraz. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure of meeting him or hearing his work, he's currently the audio director at Fuzzybot and formerly technical sound designer for Avalanche Studios. Today, we'll be looking at one of the audio systems he designed for Just Cause 4. Thank you so much for being on the show, Ronny.
So happy to be here, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me, man.
Yeah, of course. We're going to look at a gameplay clip you've provided of the sounds that you wanted to demonstrate. But before we do that, do you want to explain what we're going to see in the clip and what audio should we be listening for?
Yeah, sure. So basically, the sound that we're going to be going over today is a vehicle whoosh by system that we designed for Just Cause 4. It's a very subtle addition, but it adds a really unique effect of the vehicle actually whooshing by you. The same way if you pass a car at a close distance on like a highway going in the opposite direction, you might get that effect of the sound of the car moving quickly past you. So we wanted to recreate that inside of the experience, and we thought that it did a really good job of just adding that additional layer of depth to driving in the game.
Awesome. So let's take a listen to the clip and then we'll be right back. I love that you picked that clip because Just Cause 4 is like this big, huge, bombastic game known for being very over the top, and you picked such a subtle detail. But those are the kind of ones that I really love digging into in games because they're the ones that make you feel like you're in the world, that really give you that sense of immersion and make it feel like you're actually in the scene. Is that kind of why you picked this? Or I shouldn't try and put words in your mouth, but why did you pick this particular sound when I asked you to be on the show?
Sure. So it's like exactly what you said. When I thought about the show and after I picked the sound, I was like, oh, people might actually be a little disappointed that you hear Just Cause 4. And like you said, you expect these big, bombastic destruction, extreme weather, tornado, lots of stuff blowing up. But what's interesting about the sound of the game is it has all that, but within any sort of game, you need to give it a real dynamic character to its mix. And Just Cause 4 certainly has its peaks in the intensity of the sound design with all of the over-the-top destruction that does happen in the game. But there's also these really subtle systems that happen and are heard a lot more clearly within those plateaus of action that the players experience. And a lot of these are really interesting, robust, yet very subtle details that I feel subliminally add a lot to the experience, but you might actually miss a little bit if you're not necessarily listening to them. So the reason why I picked this sound was I think that when you're driving a vehicle, it would feel natural that the other vehicles that you pass would create this whooshing character to them. But if you're not listening for it, it might just sound like a natural part of the experience where in even just a subtle layer of this one part of the vehicle experience on top of engines, on top of transmission sounds, on top of chassis rattle and all that, there's also this additional system that goes into it to create that overall character. So I feel like even in these big expressive experiences, there's these nuanced details that are also really cool to check out.
Yeah. And do you feel that when you're working on sound design, you are more drawn to these kind of felt but not necessarily noticed sounds? Or is it kind of equal with the big ones that everyone might really grab everyone's attention?
That's a really interesting question. And I mean, the big sounds are fun. Like, it's really fun to create a big subwoofer shaking explosion. It's really cool to work on like an over-the-top weather effect or like a sniper rifle that has a lot of kick to it. But you had mentioned at the start, my role on Just Cause 4 was as technical sound designer. So a lot of the things that I was working on during that production cycle were these more systemic-based, nuanced sounds. So for me, I really enjoy the type of thought and logic that goes into these types of sounds. I think they're very cool, and I think a lot of sound designers can relate that really the character of a soundscape really exists in the details. So I like both, but I also very much enjoy problem solving and scripting. I like these sounds a lot.
So when you're designing those kinds of systems, are you thinking about them in terms of the game world and messing around and trying this, seeing what sounds good, trying this, seeing what sounds good, versus how much of it is based on what you've done before and systems that you know already work based on your past experience, I guess?
Well, with sounds like this in particular, it's a lot of trial and error and experimentation to see will it even work in game, like at the core of what it sounds like? And B, because it's so embedded within the systems and the data within the game, like what different data points are going to influence this? How do we need to adjust those to make a sound that's actually cohesive? And how do we bring all those things together? So in that regard, there's a lot of trial and error. You had talked about, are there things that you know that work from previous experiences? That can be totally dependent on the sound, depending on what you're working on. Maybe there's a dynamic mix trick that you've worked on with another game in the past that you know is just going to work for the project you're working on now. There might be a certain production technique that you know will do great for the game you're working on now. But also, I think it's really good to bring in outside influences into the experience that you're working on, even from games that might not be within the same genre. Like if there's this really cool effect that's done in a racing game, like I believe Forza does the whooshes with objects that exist on the track. Well, why can't we take something like that that's a really cool idea and contextualize that into the experience of an action-focused game like Just Cause that does have its own vehicle driving experience? Or this can be spread out to all sorts of disciplines within audio. Like maybe there's something really unique that Mario Kart does with its music that we might want to contextualize and integrate as a strategy within the music system for Just Cause 4. Again, even though it's a completely different experience, there are fundamental principles from both games that can be utilized and influence the design that we're working on here. So when all of that comes together, I think when you're trying to create something that might feel new, that might not have existed if you're working on a sequel in the games prior, or if you're working on something totally new that might be a new concept for this interesting genre that you're working on. I think drawing on a variety of experiences when you're trying to do that with a healthy dose of trial and error to see what actually works is just a really effective way to go about any sound you're approaching when it comes to audio design for games or even music design for games.
That makes sense. And then when you're thinking of these ideas, or like when you're looking at Forza or some other game and thinking about things that have worked in the past, how much of that is your leading thought versus the technical limitations? Do you ever work the other way where you're thinking, what will the programmer let me get away with? Or what will I have just access to that I could actually use as a system? How much of that informs the decision in the concept phase too?
Sure, especially in an open world experience like Just Cause, that influences the decision a lot. Like when you're looking at a lot of audio tech that's really effective in high production value games, we used Forza as an example. Each world is a track. So within that world, you can maximize the creativity that you're doing to create the character of that world that the player is in while they're racing. It's the same thing for a lot of traditionally structured first-person shooters where you have a level that exists in the game as the world, and the player is playing through that level. When they complete the level, they load in to a new part of the experience. You can maximize the creativity for that section of the game that the player is in. When you're working in an open world, especially an open world sandbox, it's a little bit different because you're dealing with streaming limitations of the world. You want everything to be dynamic and cohesive, and especially in Just Cause, a player is moving at very high speeds, grappling across the world. They have a wingsuit. They're flying around everywhere. So things can be happening and loading in rather fast. So looking at something like Forza, where it's like, okay, well, they've got all those whooshes as the player drives past every object in the game. Man, that is a really cool effect. How could we create something similar to that in our driving experience in Just Cause? And it's like, well, we might not necessarily have the overhead to get every single object in the game, but what would be really cool is if we at least got it working on AI vehicles in the traffic. So the car that the player isn't driving. So do we have the overhead for that? And what would it look like to manage the voices to make that happen and make it as cohesive of an experience as possible? Like, what can we do to make that work? And it's the same thing for other areas in the game as well. Things like ambient sound, things like if you have diegetic music placed throughout the world, maybe emitting from a radio. It's like, well, how many of these can we put into an environment? How do they interact with the soundtrack? How do we do this in such a way that it's optimized for the aesthetic experience that the player feels, but also the technical experience that the player is going to have, so the game can actually run as well as it can. These are all things that you have to consider when trying to create any type of audio system, whether it's a subtle effect like we have here, or let's say like a large dynamic ambient sound system.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. And being able to take a concept and whittle it down to what's going to be the most effective for the resources you have. Even right now, not in a sound design way, but I have that in this podcast when I want to ask you about all these things you just mentioned, but I'm trying to stay focused on the one topic here. It's a very similar skill set.
Sure, absolutely. It translates to all sorts of different disciplines for sure.
Game audio just teaches you to be better at life. It's what it is.
I support that statement. Absolutely, man.
I do want to look at what you were talking about. So let's hop into Wise and take a look at the system.
So right now we're not diving into the actual sound just yet because this is more of a procedural based sound. What we have here is a diagram of how the sound is actually going to work from the implementation in game engine and the parameters that are going to influence it all the way when we get back to middleware. And when you're working with a more technical driven sound like this is probably akin to something that you might sketch out on paper just to get an understanding of what the actual flow of the sound will be and what are the things that you envision will influence the character of the sound before actually diving in and implementing it in engine. Things like this will probably change. We have the power of hindsight right now where what we're seeing is the final version of the sound. But if you find yourself working on something like this, it's really good to dive in with some sort of plan of action, even if that plan of action becomes a little bit malleable, just to create a blueprint for what you have. There's a couple of different ways that you could go about actually implementing it in game. So we have two different versions of the implementation in this board here. We have one that's less reliant on game engine scripting and more reliant on the things that you might be able to do inside of middleware. And one aligns with logic that you might have inside of a scripting engine inside of your actual game engine. So let's take a look at this minimal engine scripting model, which is pretty close to what we actually did on Just Cause 4. So the main crux of the sound that you were hearing in that gameplay video is basically just a looping brown noise tone that's placed on all of the AI vehicle entities in the world. And the reason why we went with brown noise is it has a lot more power and amplitude towards the lower frequencies of the spectrum. So as you get to the higher portion of the frequencies, the sound that you're hearing there isn't quite as powerful. So it actually creates this bit of a softer and deeper tone. And for lack of a better term, it sounds very whooshy when you envelope it and do a lot of things to it. So this allows us to have something that sort of cut through the mix within that vehicle experience, but also wasn't quite as aggravating to the ears of the player as something like a white noise tone might be. We had to do a lot less to this to make it feel good in the mix and have it sit well. So we've got this looping brown noise on each of the vehicles in the world. But Jeff, you had asked about like, okay, well, how do you manage all of that when you're in an open world? How does that system actually work? So we've got a voice management system in place where we're actually only enabling the sound on the closest three vehicles to the player in the world. We're basically using the same thing that our vehicle engines use in order to attenuate sounds that the player doesn't need to hear. Then we have this stage here where distance creates a natural volume ramp. And we can see this asterisk here. This denotes the use of a gameplay parameter. So in this case, we're using the player's distance to the sound to say, okay, they're getting closer. We're going to start it from 0 and start to ramp it up as a whoosh. This helps create that immersion, whereas if the vehicle is a little bit farther away from the player, we get a little bit of a quieter whoosh. And if they're right there, right up against the vehicle passing it, it's like, okay, that's the maximum loud whoosh that you could get. Now we have this check where, again, we're using a parameter called player in vehicle. And we're basically using this to create a volume gate, because whether or not the player is driving, this effect is going to exist on AI vehicles. But we only want this effect if the player is actually driving. And in Just Cause, you have a lot of verticality and a lot of ways that the player might be able to pass a vehicle in traffic. So what this allows us to do is sort of control the experience a little bit and say, okay, we only actually want these to have any sort of volume if the player is actually in a vehicle of their own. Now, finally, we've got some whoosh parameters that are driven by the player's angle in relation to the sound, where it's saying, okay, we're getting close and we've got an overall ramp of the voice volume that we're going to hear as the player gets closer. But we want to make sure that the actual sound is heard at the correct angle, because if you're going to come up to the vehicle head on, you're not going to pass it. So even if you're the right distance away, we don't want to create that whoosh if it's not going to have a whooshing effect. So we want to be sure that when we enable the ramp of the sound, it's actually happening as the player approaches from the correct angle. And this also, again, creates a secondary natural ramp. So now we're starting to get a little bit of depth in the sound, where it's not just player's distance to the vehicle. Now there's some secondary modulation happening based on the player's angles. And then to add some additional character to the sound, we have some pitch variation driven by player speed. And when it comes to noise manipulation like this is much more of a subtle effect. But the idea is that when the player is driving past the vehicle faster, we get a much more high-pitched and more concise whoosh. And if they're coming a bit slower, it's going to be a lot lower and softer in character, so not quite as aggressive. And then finally, from here, we've got a really good core sound that works within the game. And from there, there's just additional randomization you could add based on gameplay parameters, maybe an additional low-pass filter based on the player's distance to the vehicle, things like that. So this is a way that you could create some logic that might be typically done inside of a game engine, just inside of your middleware framework, using the game data that's already available to you to create this effect.
Yeah, and I love that because, as we were saying with the not so flashy sounds, it's so easy to just think, oh yeah, you just put a whoosh when it passes, but you don't think about the angle, the pitch, all these different parameters are so easy to kind of forget about when you're not actually designing these systems. And it's really cool to see a breakdown like this.
Right, and it's interesting that you said that, because just a plain whoosh that you just equip there, like based on a trigger, it might feel very static, and it might not add the type of character that you're trying to add to the experience when you take away all of this additional parameterization and modulation that's happening to the sound there. And actually, that's a great segue into the game engine model that you could use to create a sound like this, which might align with that more traditional setup of we have a trigger, we have a sound, and we'll play it. So one of the ways that you could do this, which some might say is a little bit less hacky inside of a game engine, is interface it with the scripting that you have in place on your engine side. So at the start here, we've got the same brown noise object on a vehicle, but we're not really doing any limiting on it yet, because in this case, the sound trigger on and off is controlled by a distance trigger that's checking distance to the player along the XZ axis. So we're using some additional logic here to be like, okay, is the player in a vehicle, and are they a certain distance away from this emitter? In that case, our voice management comes in, where let's say they go between two cars. It's like, well, we're going to play the whoosh between the player and the vehicle that they're actually closest to, so we don't get this weird effect of cascading whooshes in the world. So as opposed to the voice management acting both as a technical as well as a creative service to the player, in this case, it's acting more as a creative service of the experience, where it's like, okay, what is the closest one that actually might be most important to the player's experience? And in this case, that natural ramp that we had triggered by that distance can still be used, but triggering it in this way from an in-game system also gives the option of tailoring it a little bit more with maybe an ADSR ramp to give a little bit more of a predictable experience to the whoosh. Either one can work really well. At that point, it's a matter of taste. You're just sort of enabling yourself the option to have that explicit on-off response with the sound effect, in this case, with the distance trigger. And in the same way we have before, we still have the whoosh parameters driven by the player's angle in relation to the sound here, because even though we're triggering it on and off, we want it to be the same cohesive experience that we have with the non-trigger model. And then the rest is implemented pretty much the same way. It's just different ways to solve the same problems in game and to sketch out as you're planning to approach this sound from a design standpoint. So let's take a look at what we have in Wwise here. For all of the sketching that we did, all of the design parameters that we have in place, it's actually quite a simple sound when you break down to the core of it. As we talked about on the diagram, the real core of the sound here is really just a brown noise tone, which we're generating from the Wwise Synth 1 plugin over here. So if we take a look at this, we can see that we have the two oscillators muted, but the noise generator we have set to red noise, which is just another descriptor of brown noise. And we have a couple of different RTPCs actually modulating the sound here. The first, we have this distance ramp that we talked about, controlling the overall output level. And then over here, we have our angle that we talked about, controlling the sound's ramp. And again, not the most complex implementation in the world. We're really following a roughly 60-ish degree pattern here of how the sound actually moves around a vehicle when we're breaking it down. So if the player is at negative, like roughly 120 to 130 degrees from the emitter, is at roughly 60 degrees from the emitter. And then if there is 0 degrees, we have it totally muted. And then again, we've got positive 60, positive 120. So all the way around the sound we're accounting for so that it feels like it's actually corresponding to a logical angle. And if we listen to that, you can see that as the player is going to be passing through these angular values and the angle is going to be changing in real time, we can see a natural whoosh effect start to take shape within the sound itself. So the character of the sound is actually responding to how the player is moving about the world to create that whoosh by experience that's actually relevant to how they're driving in the game. And the same thing can be said for additional values that we have outside of the synthesizer here. We talked about using their player speed to modulate the pitch of the sound, where we have just slight variations in pitch based on whether the player is going faster or slower in the experience. So we have this. It just subtly gets a little more aggressive in those higher pitched areas. We also have this low pass filter. Based on distance. And again, we have this gate that we've created for the sound effect here, where there's this parameter that just says, is player in vehicle? 1 yes, 0 no. That basically acts, for lack of a better term, as an on-off switch to say, okay, off, on. And so when you boil it down, it's really just an interesting use of different types of game data in order to script this sound in a cohesive way based on what the player is doing. And if we look at an example where we're actually triggering it from the game engine, so we just looked at it where everything, all the logic is done inside of middleware, but now let's look at it where we might be actually triggering this from a distance trigger. You can see that as opposed to having that on-off switch that we had in the RTPCs for voice volume here, we no longer have that. We just have the low pass filter based on distance and the pitch changes based on player speed. And if we jump into the actual RTPC view of the Wwise Synth 1 here, everything is the same in our effect settings, the same noise generator, but as opposed to modulating the output level based on distance, we're now using this custom like hand-authored envelope, which could have its own randomization and RTPC properties based off of that. So you could be availing yourself an even deeper level of manipulation for the sound, the deeper into the tech you go here. But again, the angle is set up in the exact same way. It's just the way that we're triggering the sound and the way that we're using the data available to us that is making this behave a little bit more differently. But the character is still very similar. So in this way, just a simple brown noise, or also known as red noise generator, adds just a little bit of extra character to the vehicle driving experience in the game.
And when you're setting those rules or when you're setting those RTPC values, how much of it is you thinking about, okay, what would passing by a car sound like in real life? How much pitch change would there be? How much whoosh, how long? And how much of it is just what feels satisfying in game?
That's a really great question. And that's really an eternal balance to strike, not only in game audio, but in sound design at large. Because, like, let's say, to take another example, let's say you are designing a weapon sound. Well, you're not just going to use like the straight recording of a single gunshot, because gunshots in the world on their own actually don't sound that interesting or that cool. But what you're going to do is layer a bunch of different microphone distances, maybe different weapons to create the style of that sound. So in the same way here, it's like, okay, what you take into consideration what a whoosh might sound or feel like in real life, but also you're going to take some creative liberties as to what it's going to sound like in the game and how it's going to add to the experience in the most appropriate ways. There's a lot of ways that we could have made this possibly a little bit cooler and have a little bit more depth to it in the way that the physics might actually behave in the real world in the game. But for the constraints that we were working with, the timeline that we had, and the way that it actually functions in the experience, for us, it checks all the boxes. So it really becomes a balance of what does it sound like in real life? What do we need it to sound like in the game? And how do we hit a medium there that really accentuates the player experience at that moment?
So that was really awesome. Thanks for breaking down that sound and getting to show us a little bit about the system that you created. You were so proud of that. It was the first thing you thought of when I asked you to be on the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Jeff. This was so much fun. It was great talking with you about all these really cool game audio nuances, and it was so much fun. Thank you so much for having me.
So before we wrap this up, is there anything you wanted to promote or any social media you wanted to tell us to follow you at?
You know, I don't post that much on social media, but if you'd like to follow or get in touch with me, please feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or shoot me a message there. And I'd be happy to talk with anyone if they have questions about game audio or would like to reach out in general.
Awesome. And I'll make sure to link everything Ronny just mentioned down below so you could just click it and check out his work or get in touch. Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you found this video useful or interesting, or that you'd want to see more in the future. If you could, please take the time to like, share, subscribe to the channel, all the things that really support me and make it easier for me to make more videos in the future and have on more awesome guests like Ronny.